Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about The Shape of Water. The Shape of Water isn't just a love story, it's also a lot of other things, and I think a lot of times a lot of love stories say that. But with this film, I don't necessarily know if I love all the other parts that aren't the actual love story itself. A lot of that, I think, this film, which is kind of the first big auteur kind of film from Guillermo del Toro, that feels very much just like a Guillermo del Toro film, not Guillermo del Toro does a blockbuster, Guillermo del Toro does a gothic drama, Guillermo del Toro does a Hellboy 2. This is just him being that kind of organic self, the promise that we all saw from him when we saw Pan's Labyrinth and saw this amazing directorial voice if you didn't know about him before. I don't think in the years since Pan's Labyrinth that promise hasn't really become as much as maybe we all had hoped, but The Shape of Water is seeing that promise become something and having him make his big Guillermo del Toro statement, I guess. And in a lot of ways it shows the journey he took between Pan's Labyrinth to this film, which is probably his best since Pan's Labyrinth, I'd say. With this film, often how it almost feels like him taking on a genre and taking on a lot of different things that established Hollywood movies have done before and kind of doing things with them, not necessarily reinventing the wheel, makes you kind of come to terms with what Guillermo del Toro is as a director, thinking like seeing Pan's Labyrinth, you think of it as a wholly original, crazy, beautiful, amazing kind of movie, but I think del Toro is someone who understands that no ideas are necessarily completely original, and that you're using and borrowing various things from various stories, and we live in a postmodern age, and of course that's going to happen to a certain degree. I mean, it is a early 1960s kind of period piece, and it feels like that kind of thing, but through a Hollywood eye. It doesn't feel actually like the early 1960s. It feels that kind of like polarized idea of when you do it in kind of a biopic or a period piece or something like that. But Guillermo del Toro understands what he is doing with The Shape of Water within that. He's also borrowing from various older movies, obviously The Creature from the Black Lagoon, but it's almost weird because you feel like I want to say there's more references that I can pick out, but I don't think necessarily there are. I think this just comes from a general love of movies, almost the way early 90s films did, or like Joe Dante. I keep thinking of Matinee for some reason with this, where you definitely can tell like Matinee is definitely doing William Castle, but you get this idea of the love of B movies and the love of all sorts of movies. And originally del Toro did pitch this as his remake of The Creature of the Black Lagoon, as kind of a twist on it, and then rewrote it after that because they like rejected that, the long trying to be remade Creature from the Black Lagoon. I find this movie beautiful and amazing, but also slightly overwrought and simplistic, but I still really liked it. It's so manufactured and presented in that kind of auteur way that we don't necessarily get anymore, but in a way that kind of shows someone who is kind of doing it in their own kind of less blockbustery, let's have a hit way, or even have any, you know, big box office movie stars, and have a film completely with character actors who of course are all going to be amazing, they're all amazing in most things, and having them all be a cast of misfits all throughout it, which works absolutely perfectly. It's like watching a big auteur kind of paint a broad picture and understanding why he's painting that broad picture and having a story to tell that demands that broad picture, even if this film didn't really even cost that much, but that almost makes it even that more impressive that del Toro is able to use his skill in such a way to present such a unique film the way The Shape of Water is. Now, The Shape of Water is about a mute woman, Eliza, played by Sally Hawkins, who works as a janitor at a research facility in early 1960s Baltimore, which as someone who grew up in Baltimore, is not a Baltimore I've ever seen, and I don't think this was filmed at all in Baltimore, but that's where it takes place. I don't know, because it's close to DC, and they're like, I don't know, Virginia. As a Baltimore movie, I'm happy to have it, but also as a Baltimore movie, I don't think it is, but whatever. Eliza is just living out her day being friends with a illustrator played by Richard Jenkins, and living above a movie theater, and having her friend played by Octavia Spencer be janitors together until one day a new asset is brought into the research facility, and she becomes friends with it and strikes up with romance with this new asset, who's played by Doug Jones, who's basically kind of the Gil-Man sort of creature, and she falls in love and decides she needs to break him out and free him and give him a new life because she loves him so much and doesn't want him just being abused and torn apart for research, as her and her friends band together to hopefully give her romance and this asset type creature a new life together. I think certainly what I like a lot about this film is that it does let del Toro kind of just do his kind of directorial picture, and I think that's what amazingly works about it. But it also shows a real love of romance, a real love of love, and a love of kind of the outsider, this being the early 1960s. Sally Hawkins is mute, Octavia Spencer is black, obviously you didn't know. Richard Jenkins is gay. They all band together and kind of being society's kind of outcast, not listened to, basically overlooked by the research facility and all of society, and not really welcomed in on society very much at all, and kind of showing that they are ready to embrace this sea monster kind of man. And it takes on a lot of tropes that, like, certainly when you're talking about the 60s and the 50s, you kind of just have to go like, hey, people were like super racist, like a lot of them. I think this film gets into that and certainly does it in a broad way, but this is kind of a broad sort of movie, so it's sort of appropriate. This is certainly kind of like feels like a new life on Del Toro as a director. He's someone who I've always found interesting. I'm glad certainly he never did those Hobbit movies, but it's great that he's making kind of his own thing, and certainly how well he uses all these actors. And I was kind of afraid he was just going to go from big production to big production, and it seems that this is more just shows the passion he has for storytelling, the passion he has for cinema. The shot of the Gil-Man and whatever this guy's name is, the asset or whatever, in the movie theater alone, watching the movie screen, kind of being overcome by it. This feels like, I think in the 90s there was this whole thing of like, it felt like cinema, like Hollywood movies trying to be previous Hollywood movies and having kind of a nostalgic love for it. Certainly you'd have people like Spielberg or Joe Dante who loved all that and could reference those things and knew them very well, and then you had other people who kind of sort of remembered Bogart was in a movie at one time or something. And Shape of Water feels like more of those guys, where you can tell like he probably watched a bunch of films that in an interview he's going to reference, and I'm like, either what is that, or go, oh, I didn't even think of that. He just has such a love of that period, he doesn't even need to. Having everything from a musical number at one point, which seemed to almost come out of nowhere, to everything that's going on with the period, like early 60s is sort of the 50s kind of McCarthyism, sort of pre-Kennedy sort of thing that I think Del Toro wraps up in this very well, but he almost like finds a way to, kind of like what we're doing with a lot of our older things around that era, find a way to recontextualize an idea of the creature from the Black Lagoon. Obviously that was, of the monster movies, considered more of the 50s Universal monster. All the other guys were from the 30s, and how he was supposed to represent more of the atomic age, and why not bring the atomic age to the space race and all the kind of paranoia with the Russians that were going on. It's all kind of shaping this movie, and I think that's kind of really smart, while also having a really beautiful love story between Sally Hawkins and Doug Jones. Sally Hawkins, who's just honestly usually really great in things, although I can't think of too many. I don't think I've reviewed enough that she's in, really. This is this mute woman. I think she's just absolutely wonderful and has such a great screen presence. It's kind of weird. I think I was realizing, I heard someone watching the trailer, this film is so visual, and certainly because they have a mute character in it, that it didn't feel like any other trailer would have felt like that's the trailer, that's the movie, but not seeing her, this didn't feel right. She's such a major part of it, but she never really speaks. Spoilers, I guess. I think that is really beautiful how she does that, and it kind of shows a real visual storyteller, the way Del Toro is able to use her. Especially also Doug Jones, who's kind of been a supporting player. I guess if there's a stable of actors that Del Toro has, he's definitely kind of the lead guy. He's been in Pan's Labyrinth, to Hellboy, and all sorts of stuff. And it's cool how he does a real physical performance. I mean, they're both doing real physical performances, but that's not something actors nowadays are necessarily. There's certain actors who can do it very well, and then most, I think, are more used to, you know, using their words, basically, and that's how most people are trained even. But Doug Jones is able to do so well in this, it almost doesn't feel like the same Doug Jones who did Ape Sapien, but it also does. He is able to bring such a level of humanity to that character, and almost as much as the actors who would bring those classic Universal monsters to life. Like, Doug Jones seems to get into that and kind of understand like why he's moving this certain way, and understand the caringness of what he's doing, and almost the animalistic nature of that as well. You know, you almost take for granted what Doug Jones is doing in a lot of this stuff, and I think this kind of highlights more of him as an actor than I've ever seen him in a Del Toro film before. It really shows you how amazing of an actor he really can be. You've had all these films, like particularly Crimson Peak, where it's almost like more about the production design, how beautiful it looks, and it really one of the more beautiful looking movies I've seen in the last couple of years. But I think this combines what we know of Del Toro as a good storyteller, as well as a visual stylist, and how good he is with that. And it almost feels better that he was able to not be so inundated with all that, the way he's probably been in his last couple of movies, and the way people want him to be, certainly because of who he is. But I think he is able to use the camera certainly really well. He has a lot of fun with the color green, like way too much fun. There's a lot of green in this movie, but it's still like, it works so well within the film. This kind of shows you what a great stylist can do and a great auteur stylist can do. He almost seems to use the broad strokes of doing this kind of period piece almost too well. Michael Shannon, who most people I think almost a little sick of him, always playing the kind of conservative voice of the past, holding everyone down in all these period things. I think he was actually cast on purpose, and it's less like he's like, oh, I'll just do another one of these again, and more of, hey, let's get him to do this role he does very well. Del Toro almost cast this whole thing with all these various like big character actors, and Michael Shannon's certainly one of those. Having all these character actors almost gave it more of a classic Hollywood feel to it, because in classic Hollywood you'd have all these really, really well-trained actors, and I don't necessarily think you have that as much now. So having like really amazing, like, you know, how many Oscar nominations between these people kind of cast within this film, I think really actually kind of like helped it be more of the classic Hollywood thing than a lot of films that try to do that sort of thing are. But this also feels very, you know, of its time and now. I think this film will probably never be like the huge success that maybe, you know, we'd want it to be, and maybe like certain things like Stephen Chow's The Mermaid or something like that. Of course, that was a lot more fun. All the metaphors and interesting things that Del Toro does within this kind of reminds me of why I really liked him at a certain point. I still was going to see any film he made anyway, but there's a certain point where you've pushed the auteurism a little too far, and I'm just sort of going because I'm going, and you have to have made something really great for me to go on that whole journey. You can look at the filmography of Orson Welles is probably one of those things where you're like, wow, Citizen Kane is great, but as you keep going, you're like, I don't know if I like all of it. And I think this was like a much needed refresher on him. Certainly I like Crimson Peak. I didn't love it, but and I got what he was doing, and it was appropriate for what he was doing, and he's very good at using those genres and understanding what to do with them. This almost felt like he's conservatively using them but also breaking from them in certain ways. It's like you almost understand where this movie's gonna go, but you don't know where this movie's gonna go, and it shows like a real smart storyteller that he can interweave that going throughout The Shape of Water. I think the score by Alexander Desplat is probably one of his best scores he's ever done. It kind of sings to this film's lyricism and the real love of breaking free of the confines of the society that they're in. The Shape of Water is kind of the beautiful creature love story that we haven't had in a really long time, if ever, and if ever done this well. And it feels sort of like almost like a French film in a lot of ways. It feels in love with Hollywood in almost the French New Wave way also. It feels in love with love. It feels beautiful and wonderful. I think, honestly, there are maybe too many subplots for me personally. I think that almost distracted from it. This movie did definitely feel a bit too long, and having everyone from Michael Stolberg to Octavia Spencer to Richard Jenkins to Michael Shannon having various different subplot scenes and stuff like that, I didn't really necessarily feel like that worked as well as the Sally Hawk and Doug Jones scenes did. And those scenes, I think, were what you're coming for this film and what this film's soul is. And all this other stuff I don't necessarily think worked entirely as well. I think it kind of diverted too much, but I still sort of love this movie and love that Del Toro did this and love what Del Toro is doing with it. Diverging too much from that love story kind of almost like watered this down a little more than I think I would have necessarily liked. You're having to walk through all this kind of other stuff, which was still great, and he had such great character actors, he almost can get away with it, but I don't think he entirely does. This doesn't live up to certainly the better Del Toro films, but I certainly think it is a kind of step in the right direction and a kind of turn at a time when maybe not necessarily people are speaking his name when we're talking about big auteurs as much as we used to about 10 years ago. This is very much a film that shows he is a great storyteller, and he knows what stories he's using to make himself that great storyteller. And that's the amazing thing about The Shape of Water. But when you're leaving it, you almost are just happy with the love story. You're happy what these people accomplished, and I was just happy to see a really great and richly beautiful Del Toro film again, and honestly making me feel like it's maybe been too long. So if you have seen The Shape of Water and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.